Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 81 of the Ask Historians podcast. Our topic today will be Iphikrates, the ancient Greek general, and presenting the topic will be Iphikrates, not the actual Greek general, but we'll let him introduce it a little better, and we'll talk about it. But it's a wonderful episode, and absolutely, I think this may be one of my more recent favorites. Actually, that feels very cruel to the other ones, but no, this really is a great episode, and I hope you'll enjoy it. And also, I hope that you enjoyed last episode as well. Our fresh baby new co-host cutting his teeth. So I hope you went back and listened to the episode on cultural genocide of Native Americans that we had last episode 2 weeks ago. And I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you're looking forward to hearing more from him in the future, because I know you all get tired of my voice. So, what you probably don't get tired of is, of course, the Ask Historians book giveaway. It is, of course, the first episode of the month, so we are going to take some of the proceeds that our Patreon supporters, their support, and give a little back. So, as per usual, we have 4 books that the winner will be able to choose from, and those 4 books are Bad Language, Naked Ladies, and Other Threats to the Nation, A Political History of Comic Books in Mexico by Anne Rubenstein, who recently did a AMA for us on Ask Historians. We have Making Ethnic Choices, California's Punjabi Mexican Americans. That is recommended by Cordis Mellum. We have Song of Wrath, The Peloponnesian War Begins, and that's recommended by our guest today. And finally, my pick for this month is going to be The Myth of Race, The Troubling Persistence of an Unscientific Idea by Robert Wald Sussman. So I hope whoever is going to win this, I already know, but I hope whoever wins this here's one of those titles ringing in their ears, and I hope they're happy with it. So today we're going to be giving one of those away to Mark Catterberg. So Mark, I'll be contacting you through the email that you have on Patreon, and I'll have you let you pick out one of those and let me know which one you want, and I'll have it sent your way for your pleasure and enjoyment. Whether you read it or whether you eat it, it's all up to you. I suggest reading it. So, enough silliness. Let's get on to the show, shall we?
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today, I am here with, he goes by the name of Iphikrates on Ask Historians. Most people in or outside that life would call him Rule. We've had him on before. We've talked about ancient Greek warfare, which is his specialty. So, Rule, why don't you go ahead and tell us what we're talking about today, since it appears to be near and dear to your heart.
So, what we're talking about today is the 4th century BC Athenian general called Iphikrates. And obviously, that is my username. And so, it kind of, I'm very happy that I finally get a chance to talk about him. Because, well, to me, there's 2 reasons why I sort of want to go by this avatar, or wanted to basically call myself after him. Is the first is that in many ways what we talked about last time in the podcast, this big battle of the Nemea, like this big pitched hoplite battle, is sort of the top of the iceberg of Greek warfare, and it's the side that you can see. But Iphikrates in many ways is a portal to like the other 90% of that iceberg that is submerged. Like he is a representative of all the different kinds of fighting that occurred in Greek warfare that is not this sort of big, spectacular, open battle. He's on the crossroads between service in citizen armies, mercenary service. He serves both his home state and on mercenary service abroad. He serves with navies and armies. He does all sorts of different things. And he is involved in a lot of different things over quite a long and dramatic period of Greek history. So in many ways, even though he never took part in any sort of major pitched engagement, he represents and brings out so many different themes that are much more sort of characteristic of Greek warfare in this period, things that we should be looking at.
Well, before we get into kind of Iphikrates the man and his exploits, why don't you go ahead and kind of fill us in? Because Iphikrates is an Athenian. And so why don't you kind of give us, a very quick kind of rundown of the situation of Athens at this time, and more kind of importantly, how does one join the Athenian military? Who are the generals at this point? Who's leading the ranks?
Right. So, the most important thing to recognize about classical Greece is there's no military. There is no army. No state has an army. There is nothing like that. there are a couple of states by this time that are starting to experiment with raising standing units, but they're small units. They're going to be sort of this rigid core of a battle line. But for the most part, there just isn't anything like a military institution or a military career or a military academy. There's just nothing like that. When a city-state goes to war, they call up their citizens. Like, they just call out a number of citizens, usually within certain age groups, or they will have lists of people who are eligible, and they just pick out the ones they want. And those are just people. They're just ordinary people, and they are the defenders of their city-state. And so when you, like, if you want to engage in any kind of military affairs, either you have to wait for the call or you have to become a mercenary. Those are basically your only two options. There's no military career, there's no professional military, there's nothing like that anywhere. The reason for that primarily is that the Greek city-states just have very poorly developed financial systems. They don't really have the means to effectively extract a reliable amount of revenue from their population, which is generally also very small. And the result of that is they just can't afford to do the kind of things that we think a state does, like maintaining an army, for instance. They just don't have the money to do that. There's only a couple of exceptions to that rule, generally, which is those city-states that manage to gather sort of large territorial empires, and they sort of extract the revenue from that, and then that gives them more options to create like navies, naval yards, sometimes, building up the first beginnings of standing units. But for the most part, they just can't afford to do that.
But of course, for these city-states which are going to war fairly often, warfare seems to be kind of a constant theme of classical history. Surely there must be kind of, as they're doing these kind of, I guess, mass levies, or, I guess if we want to be anachronistic about it, a draft. Surely they're recognizing that, some of these people are a little bit better at this than other people. I mean, is it possible for someone to kind of rise up to a higher position simply through their skill in warfare, or is that kind of restricted totally, positions of leadership, is that restricted, completely to the people who are the upper crust, the elites?
So the idea is that the military experience is very much just, it remains this amateur thing. Like, you do it at need. And like I said, the main reason for that limitation is structural. They just don't have the money. But of course, because they're fighting a lot, they do have people have time to build up a sense of military experience, and some of them will stand out. Now, generally speaking, when you were talking about Athens in particular, other democratic states, in this period, so in the 4th century BC, we're talking about the restored Athenian democracy, which is the full, like the democracy in its full and complete form. There is a very strong reluctance to elect people, or to basically assign people certain roles, because they think that's undemocratic. Basically, if you elect someone, then that person can influence the election based on his means, based on his networks, based on his persuasive powers, which means that obviously the rich are going to be in the advantage. So they assign all of their official positions by lot. Basically, you cannot build up a career, you cannot maintain any kind of permanent presence in politics, because all of these stations that you might have, treasurer or head of the assembly or anything like that, they're rotated. They're very short terms, and they're assigned by lot, so you can't control them. The only exception to that rule is the generalship, because the Athenians and the other Greeks recognize that for war you just need expertise. You just need to be better at it. And so you can't afford to squander that expertise by making someone a general for a year and then saying you can never be a general again, which is what they do normally with all of their other offices. So instead they say, okay, the generalship, okay, fine, we'll let that be an elected post. And so the people who are ostensibly the most skilled at it can get a shot at building up, a longer career as a general and serving their city with their expertise. And so this is the only place where there's really any possibility for someone to rise to a high position of prominence through skill alone. Basically, as long as they can make themselves famous as a good soldier, as a good leader, can they actually attain some level of permanence within this completely draft-based, temporary, ad hoc military system.
So I guess this brings us to Iphikrates. I mean, where in Athenian society did he start? Because, clearly he ends up as a famous general. But, how did he get there to begin with?
Yeah, so this is actually a very funny story, because even though there's this idealistic background to the idea of the generalship being elected being therefore meritocratic, most of the time, of course, the people who are elected generals are still going to be the prominent orators, the people who say, like, I've got the answers to our foreign policy, I know how to fix this, I know how to deal with this situation. And so they're going to be, for the most part, very, very rich men. And throughout the classical period, most of the generals of Athens are very, they're the absolute, top of the elite families of the city. But there are a couple of exceptions, and they start to appear sort of in the 4th century, and Iphikrates is the best example of it. Because he's not a rich man. He is the son of a man called Timotheus, who was a shoemaker. He was just a cobbler. And he rose through the ranks primarily because of conspicuous displays of valor. He fought as a deck fighter, as an Ephikrates, which is often translated marine, but I think that's slightly anachronistic. I prefer the term deck fighter. Basically, they're the heavy infantry who fight on board triremes. During the Corinthian War in the 390s, he fights in the great sort of decisive naval battle of Knidos, which is in 394. And he performs this great feat of heroism. He fights on another ship's deck, on an enemy ship, which they have boarded, and he is wounded in battle, but he nevertheless takes the guy who wounded him, drags him into the sea, wearing his armor. He swims to his home ship with his captive and brings him safely on board. So there's this sense of you what? He's this sort of supernatural almost, this valor and strength and disregard for his own safety, which brings him into the spotlight in 394. And then very soon after that, we suddenly see him, being in a position of leadership in the Athenian army.
I mean, it seems like he's a little bit incredible there. I mean, I do know that you had sent me a Roman era biography, I believe, which described him as, kind of a very tall, athletic, and strong man. But is that kind of the beginning of this? I guess, how much should we actually trust about, his early beginnings?
Oh yeah, so this is a very difficult problem actually, because most of the information that we get from this kind of thing, like the information that he was the son of a cobbler, the information that he was in the Battle of Knidos, this is all derived from very late sources, and no contemporary source really tells us anything about this. They just tell us when he is actually in Athenian service and where he pops up. And they don't talk about common soldiers. They don't talk about common men generally. Historical accounts don't like to talk about people who are not important. So they don't mention him at all until he's very prominent. So these kind of details we rely on later sources, and we really have to be careful whether we accept those kind of things, those kind of stories or not. But in this case, it really, because it's the only information we get, and because nothing necessarily denies it, refutes it, we can, to some extent, maybe accept that this may have been one of the ways in which he could have risen to prominence. Because the big question otherwise is how did he do it? Because he just wasn't, he didn't have any of the means that generals normally use to rise to prominence, which is lots of money, oratory skills, the attention of a large political network, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, then how does he end up kind of hitting that turning point from being, someone who was not important, i.e. a common soldier, someone who was only important kind of in aggregate, to someone whose name we now know and who had, biographies written about him centuries later when it comes down to it, because he fought a lot of battles. Is there one kind of in particular where he kind of has like a turning point where he goes from common soldier to famous soldier?
Yeah, so he has one big claim to fame, which is the Battle of Lycaon, which is fought in 390 BC near the city of Corinth. And the backstory of this is long and complicated. It comes down to the fact that during those years, Iphikrates was essentially the commander of a force of mercenaries that the Athenians had dispatched towards their ally Corinth to protect them against Spartan invasion. And during his service there, sort of in permanent garrison in Corinth, he ambushes and wipes out a Spartan army unit. Basically, he just sort of out of nowhere, with a bunch of light armed infantry mercenaries, he destroys an entire unit of Spartan hoplites, who are obviously regarded as the best warriors in Greece. And from that moment on, he sort of has this completely incredible reputation for being able to handle any possible challenge.
Well, I mean, this sounds kind of like it was an incredible feat recognized at the time, but I mean, how much was it really out of the ordinary? Because looking back now, of course, we have this hugely, I don't want to say inflated, but let's say a slightly inflated, opinion of the Spartans. And of course, they seem like they were a formidable military force back in the day even. But I mean, what was the role of these light troops at the time? Was it so out of the ordinary that they'd be able to take on, these kind of very stereotypical Spartan phalanx of heavily armed infantry?
So no, this is actually something that a lot of modern authors have made a much bigger point of than ancient authors do. I mean, the idea that light infantry can take on and defeat a hoplite force in isolation is generally sort of accepted. In classical Greece, they know that this can happen. And in fact, it happened several times before. In the late 5th century, there is famously an Athenian force that gets dispatched to northern Greece to try and help out a garrison army they have besieging a city over there. And it encounters a bunch of local people, and they manage, the Athenian hoplites managed to crush their opposing heavy infantry. But then the enemy light troops and cavalry just sort of have them in isolation and just wipe them out. This happens again a couple of years later when they have a hoplite force that gets sent into Aetolia, which is a territory where people traditionally fight as light armed troops. The hoplites go out alone because their allies who were light armed didn't turn up. And so they just sort of get isolated in the hills and wiped out by light troops. And even the Spartans themselves had suffered a reverse like this before. Very famously, in 425 BC, on the island of Sphacteria, a small unit of Spartan hoplites gets trapped there by the Athenian navy. And the Athenians land just a vast number of light armed troops and basically just harry them and gradually deplete and exhaust them until the Spartans surrender. And this is something that is obviously sends shockwaves through Greece. Like, they have no idea what just happened. How did Spartans surrender? I thought they never did that. But the idea is that the Spartans at that point show themselves to be less than this superhuman profile that they like to sort of spread of themselves, this propaganda notion of themselves as superhuman warriors. It just shows that they're just ordinary hoplites in many ways. And if they are overwhelmed by light armed troops through sort of very well-known and tried and tested tactics, they can't hold it. They have to, at some point, either surrender or flee.
Well, but before we get too much into a history of Sparta and its propaganda at the time, we're kind of throwing out this term, light troops, as if everyone else listening is a scholar of classical Greek warfare. But what do we mean when we say light troops?
So the idea is that the stereotypical, I guess, a Greek warrior is a hoplite. So a heavily armed infantryman who has a large round shield and a thrusting spear and who fights in close combat. And this is what all of the Spartans are, essentially. All of their citizens are hoplites, and all of the major battles involve very large numbers of hoplites duking it out with each other. But in the margins of that, there are very large numbers of people in Greek warfare who simply can't afford the equipment to fight as hoplites. And they generally fight as light armed troops, which is to say that they don't have the kind of armor, the shield, the helmets, and that kind of stuff to fight in close combat. And so they fight generally with missile weapons. So those who can afford it might have like a clutch of javelins. They might have a bow and arrow if they have time to practice with it. They might have sling and some sling stones. Or they might just sort of go into battle essentially wearing their clothes and throwing rocks at the enemy because they just don't have the money to buy anything more than that. But as these kind of victories of these light armed troops start stacking up, in the 5th century, this starts to be a realization that actually there's a lot of power in that form of warfare simply because it avoids close combat. It means it can avoid the losses and the risks involved in this hard fighting of hoplites while still inflicting a lot of damage on the enemy. And at that point, they start to hire specialist light infantry, essentially. They start to realize that it's an important addition to a hoplite army to have a couple of professional, capable, well-practiced troops who are professionally using missile weapons like javelins or like bow and arrow, basically, or slings.
So, I mean, is that what we're seeing at this battle of Lycaon? I hope I'm pronouncing that correct.
So at Lycaon, yes. I mean, the idea is that the Athenians, with the garrison they send out, this garrison of mercenaries, of which Iphikrates is the commander, is a force of so-called peltas, which is to say they are javelin men, they are armed with javelins, and their form of protection is a small light shield called a pelte. And that is essentially their armament, and they're named after the shield. So the shield's called a pelten, so they're called peltasts. And the idea is that these are just javelin men. So they approach the enemy, they throw javelins at them, and if the enemy tries to close with them, they run away. That's their form of fighting. And these are the men that the Athenians go and send to garrison their allied city. And it's not the first time that they've hired sort of a large number of peltasts. They've been doing that for decades at this point. They just know that a force of predominantly hoplites, such as most citizen armies are, can use and can be really enhanced and augmented by the addition of some professional light troops of this kind. And so they've been hiring peltasts for some decades to do exactly that, to increase the flexibility and the professionalism of their own militia forces.
So to get to the details of this particular battle, I mean, is this kind of where, I mean, are we seeing essentially these peltasts kind of run forward, hurl their javelins, and then retreat back as the Spartan hoplites advance, kind of, and then taking advantage of breaks in their ranks?
So what happens is, I mean, if you want to sketch the battle, it basically happens when a force of Spartans that is garrisoned in Lycaon, which is the harbor of Corinth, but they've taken the harbor, and the Athenians and Corinthians and Argives still hold the city. So the Spartan army there, they have a number of men in their ranks who are from a particular town in Spartan territory called Iphikrates. And those people have a particular religious festival that they want to celebrate. And so they get sent home. Essentially, a bunch of those men are allowed leave to go home and celebrate this festival. But as they march out of Lycaon, out of the harbor, the shelter of the harbor, Iphikrates sees them marching without any kind of support, without, cavalry or light armed troops to help them. And so you recognize these are only hoplites. They're going to be slow on their feet. They can only handle close combat. I'm going to attack them with my peltasts and just sort of deny them the opportunity to fight the kind of battle that they want to fight. So deny them the chance to come to grips. Just keep harassing them and running away if they advance. So that's exactly what he does. He advances his large number of peltasts down onto the road where they're going to march by. And he starts just throwing waves of javelins at them. And when they try to catch up, they just sort of run away. And they just keep going back and forth in waves. And as this is described, and this is, like I said, not the first time this has happened. There are many other examples of the exact same tactics being used against isolated hoplites, which are just, they should never be isolated. This is the lesson that is, repeated again here, but has been repeated throughout Greek warfare for like half a century at this point. Hoplites should never be alone. They should never have no support from any other troop type, because when they do, they just don't have the ability to defend themselves against light-armed, flexible, mobile missile troops and cavalry who just advance at them, throw their missiles, and then the hoplites, all they can do is try to catch them. So they run out at them. But of course, the light-armed troops, being more lightly equipped, they just run away and they're faster. And so they just can't catch them. And they lose men when they're under fire. And as they run away, at some point they have to turn back and make it back to their phalanx. When they turn back, they immediately lose men again because they turn their backs on the enemy. So they're constantly suffering, both in the attack and in the defense. They're suffering losses and they can't do anything about it.
But I mean, these peltasts, it seems like had the Spartans, had a cavalry wing with them, then it seems like this tactic of the peltasts would have been basically completely destroyed, essentially. I mean, is this kind of like a rock, paper, scissors situation where, cavalry beats peltast beats hoplite beats, I guess, hoplite?
In an open field, yes. I mean, it would be. So if you're attacking hoplites with light armed troops, and provided you have enough time and enough ammunition, you will always win. There is just no question the hoplite cannot win. At the same time, if you have a force of cavalry, of course, they are even faster on their feet than light-armed troops. They are even more mobile and more flexible. And they can attack both in, at range with javelins or in close combat with swords or lances. So they have the complete advantage over light-armed troops who don't have a formation to protect themselves and don't have heavy equipment in order to fight cavalry. So if there is an aggressive force of cavalry present, then the peltasts themselves, the light-armed troops, have to be on their guard, and they usually end up taking severe losses if they're attacked by cavalry. And the Spartan unit that is retreated, that is being brought home, essentially, that is retreating from Lycaon, does have a small guard of cavalry with them. So theoretically, they should have been protected against Iphikrates' peltast attacks. But as Xenophon, who gives us the contemporary account of this battle, he he really admonishes the Spartan cavalry for not doing its job there, because they're not aggressive. They are too timid, they are cautious, they're afraid of the peltas, and as such, they refuse to advance in the chase of these peltas beyond where their own hoplites are. And so they don't help. They don't add anything to the Spartan situation, where theoretically they should be aggressive and they should plow straight into the peltas and wipe them out. Instead, they are being very cautious. They're not advancing beyond the hoplite line, and as such, they're useless. They might as well not have been there.
So to bring us back to Iphikrates, I mean, was he clearly he was not the famous general that he would become at this point, but is that shown by the fact that he was leading these peltas as opposed to hoplites? And
yes, so this is a really interesting thing, actually. At this point, according to our closest source, Xenophon, he is not even a general at this point. So the generals, they're called strategoi. This is like the title that they have, and this is the office that they are elected to. And Xenophon pointedly doesn't refer to Iphikrates as a strategos. He says he is merely archonton peltasikon, so he's the leader of the peltas. And the idea is he's, even at the Battle of Lycaon, which is his great claim to fame, his great victory, he is actually a subordinate commander. The actual commander of the Athenian army in this battle is a general called Callias, who has nothing else to his name. It's basically unknown otherwise. But he's the general, and he leads a hoplite formation, which kind of hangs back and sits in the background and watches Iphikrates do his thing. But the idea is Iphikrates is not in command officially. And this is probably his role, is that he is assigned to this mercenary body that the Athenians have hired to garrison Corinth. He is sent to this unit in order to sort of help them liaise with the other Athenian and allied forces in the city, and to help them sort of integrate them into the Athenian expeditionary force that is serving there. So he has a function of sort of commander of a subordinate unit, and he serves under essentially the actual strategos who commands hoplites.
But clearly, this was the battle that catapulted him up into the stratosphere, to make a terrible pun. But did he continue to be like a light infantry specialist? Do we see throughout the rest of Iphikrates' careers that he relies more on these peltas than upon kind of more the traditional hoplites?
Certainly not. And this is actually an interesting thing about the careers of generals. Like, just as I said, there is no sort of structured military in Athens at this time or anywhere in Greece. There is also no real distinction between different roles of specific generals. There is no general of the light armed troops or general or a distinction even between generals and admirals. So generals get assigned different posts based on what the state happens to be doing at that time. And as a result, even though Iphikrates becomes very famous as a general of peltas, and he apparently keeps his peltas unit to some extent intact for several years, he is commander of that force of mercenaries for a long time. In later campaigns, he gets assigned a particular detachment of troops. Sometimes they are ships with their rowing crews and the deck fighters. Sometimes they are expeditionary forces, mixed forces of hoplites and peltas, mixed forces of other unit types or mercenaries. It just depends on what his city needs him to do or what the situation offers him, essentially.
Well, I mean, does he have other kind of notable victories like this one kind of spectacular victory over the Spartans that he had, or do we see him just kind of serving with distinction but not with kind of these spectacular victories?
Actually, he almost immediately after Lycaon, in the next year, for some reason he's moved. I mean, presumably he is objecting to some things that the Athenians are telling him to do, and so he's moved to a different theater of the war. So this is still the Corinthian War that's going on, in which Athens is fighting Sparta, but it's a very complicated story. It takes place all over the Aegean, basically. There's different aspects to this. And he gets sent north to the coast of what is now sort of northwestern Turkey, where he has to take on another Spartan garrison there. And he defeats them by just sort of ambushing them while they're marching around. The idea is that the Spartan general Anaxibius has become overconfident because no one dares to oppose him in the area. And so he's marching around without sort of proper scouting or without making sure that everything is safe. He's marching sort of casually through this territory, and at some point Iphikrates just sort of ambushes him, wipes out his personal bodyguard, sends his entire army running, and really sort of weakens the Spartan grip over over that particular area to the benefit of Athens. But then later on, I mean, he commands large naval contingents, he commands large mercenary contingents, he has numerous other victories all through his career. There is a strong sense that even though we can't sort of pin down great glorious moments like the Battle of the Chion or this particular battle of Abydos, it is still clear that every time Athens is in a particular deep trouble, like in a situation where they don't really know how to fix it, they just appoint him general again. They just keep electing him general to sort of take on the most difficult task. Whenever there's a mission impossible, they just say, "Oh, who should we elect general?" Well, you remember that guy Iphikrates? He's reliable. He solves problems, and so they call the wolf essentially. they keep electing him, and this goes on for like 4 decades.
So clearly, I mean, he gets a reputation in Athens as, very competent and also kind of an outside the box thinker, I guess you'd say, someone who gets the job done. But I mean, you also mentioned that a lot of times there's you said earlier that the only way to kind of build up your military reputation, and clearly, Iphikrates is doing that in the service of Athens. But you also mentioned that there might be mercenary work. Does Iphikrates ever kind of hire himself out?
So what happens in the 4th century is that, I mean, as we mentioned earlier, like the Greek city-states are increasingly aware that it's better to have a professional military, that mercenaries and standing troops and troops that have been prepared and trained function better on the battlefield and are more reliable in warfare than just sort of citizen militia. And they also realize that if they want their interests served, they have to have permanent forces in various places. Like they have to garrison passes and strategic positions in cities that they want to keep under control. And so there is an increasing demand for basically money to pay for standing forces and for standing forces themselves. And so what you see happening is that in a lot of cases of 4th century generals, if they are particularly successful and well known, they eventually get hired out to other places in order to make money for their home state to pay for mercenaries, which is essentially how it works. It seems slightly bizarre, but there are various cases where various generals who actively do this, they get sent out on mercenary service and the money gets channeled back into their home city, and their home city pays its wars out of that chest.
And so, I mean, do we have notable instances with Iphikrates being basically kind of loaned out by Athens?
Yeah, well, there's the most famous example, and this is really, it's a very particular example because it's sort of a response to another general loaning himself out. In the 380s, Egypt revolts from the Persian Empire. And you might think this has nothing to do with this whole situation, but there's a lot of links in this period between all of the different powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Athenians know about this, and they have a general called Chabrias, who is also very famous. He's basically takes himself to Egypt. He's not serving Athens at this point, not in an official capacity, but he takes himself to Egypt and serves the newly appointed or newly empowered pharaoh of the Egyptians and helps them fight off the Persian attempt to reincorporate Egypt into the Persian Empire. And this angers the Persians, of course, because they recognize that an Athenian is helping their enemies. And so they go to Athens and say, "What are you doing? Do you want us to get mad at you, or are you going to try and help us fix this?" And the Athenians recognize that they don't want to antagonize the Persians anymore because, that would cost even more money to try and do anything about. And generally, the Persians in this period are more or less dictating Greek policy by the sheer threat of supporting enemies of particular city-states with money, because they just have so much more of it than any Greek city-state. And so the Athenians have to really worry about the Persians, about antagonizing the Persians. And so they say, okay, so Chabrias gets recalled, and then it's like, what do you want us to do? And the Persians say, we need help to try and defeat the Egyptians. Why don't you send us Iphikrates to come and command our mercenaries against this rebellion? Now, I mean, it seems strange that the Persians would ask for Iphikrates specifically. Maybe he had such a reputation by the 370s that he was simply a known name, even in the Persian court. But it's also possible that what the Persians actually did was just ask for a general, maybe ask for their best general, and there was an obvious choice.
So to just kind of recap this, Iphikrates ended up in Egypt in service of the Persians because the Egyptians revolted, and another Athenian general went to go help them, and then the Persians objected to that and said, take your general home and also give us one of yours?
That's exactly it, yeah. So he gets sent to Phoenicia, where the Persians are gathering their expeditionary force, and they're sort of building it up and training it and preparing it for the invasion of Egypt. And he's there for several years, probably about 3 or 4 years. He is in Persian service in Phoenicia and eventually in Egypt, doing the bidding of the Persians.
Now, I mean, how unusual is this? Because, clearly, most people, as they learn about Greek history, and they'll probably learn Greek history instead of Persian history, most people, learn of Persians as, kind of the big bad, the giant scary force that's always going to swamp down on the Greeks. And clearly, if the Persians are able to kind of strong arm the Athenians into giving them, a general and recalling another one, that it seems like they do have, it's an existential threat. But how unusual was it for a Greek city-state to hire out their generals to the Persians?
So this is, we need to go back a little bit for this. This is something like a feature of the classical period. Of course, in the 5th century, the Persians are defeated and, the Persian wars are won by the Greeks, and Persia gets pushed back from the western reaches of their empire. But their policy after that is focused pretty much entirely, their policy in the West, on stabilizing their western border, which mostly involves trying to regain control over the Greek cities in Asia Minor, in western Turkey. And they do this by essentially trying to divide and rule, to play divide and rule in mainland Greece. They play out different sort of Greek city-states against each other by offering mostly financial support to one side or the other, depending on which side is winning at the time. And they basically just do that in order to weaken the Greek city-states and enforce their own interests. And at the end of the Corinthian War in 386, they manage finally to get that prize that they've been looking for, which is to say an acknowledgement by the Greeks that the Greek cities of Asia Minor are in the Persian realm, that they belong to the Persians and that no Greek city has claim to them, which is, this is achieved literally just by the Persians strong arming a Greece that is exhausted by warfare and that has no more money, and simply just saying, like, if any of you are going to threaten my rule over this region, I'm going to support your enemies, essentially. I'm just going to give your enemies the money to destroy you. And that is how he rules over Greece. And throughout the 4th century, this is essentially the situation that remains. Every time there is any kind of threat that a Greek city-state can build up enough power to form a threat to Persia, they immediately step in and say, if you don't cut that out, we are going to support your enemies. And they don't even have to invest any troops. They don't have to run any risks. All they have to do is play this game of, we have a lot of money and you don't want it to go to your enemies. So by doing that, they can force the Greeks to essentially dance to their tune, to retain this sort of tenuous balance of power, to stay small, to stay squabbling among each other, and to relinquish their claim to liberating the Greeks of Asia, essentially. And as a result of that, a lot of these Greek city-states end up serving the Persians simply because the Persians are, firstly, the only paymasters, the ones who have a lot of money to offer. And secondly, because if the Persians ask, you give. That's how it works. Because otherwise, again, they're going to fund your enemies.
So if you don't give them what they want, they're going to find someone who will, and that'll be the person who you don't want having.
And so there are lots of examples of Greek generals from the 4th century who end up in Persian service. And it's not just Athenians. Iphikrates, Chabrias, Chares, Conon, they're all serving in Persian service at one point or another. But also, Spartan generals as well. Agesilaus twice actually serves satraps who were rebelling from the Persians, first in Phrygia in Asia Minor, and then in the late 360s, he actually goes to Egypt to do exactly what Chabrias did, to support a rebellion against the Persian throne. So he, like a king of Sparta, takes mercenary service with the Egyptian pharaoh against the Persians because they need money. So they will do whatever they can.
So a lot of Greek free agents roaming around at the time, kind of.
Absolutely. And this is why, a lot of these generals have been referred to in literature as basically condottieri, like this Renaissance idea of Italian mercenary captains who basically have a band of troops loyal to them and they will serve whoever has the money to pay for them. But this is not quite right, because all of these generals, with the occasional exception like Chabrias in Egypt, who is not acting on official orders. But most of the time, they are actually acting in the interest of their city-states. They're loyal to Athens or Sparta, and they're just trying to, get some money into the treasury by using the assets that they have, which in this case is military skill and a band of mercenaries that has a proven capability.
Well, let's travel back over to Phoenicia and Iphikrates and his Persian troops that he's leading. Is he going into Egypt to fight, Egyptian, I guess, Egyptian phalanxes? I mean, what do the troops look like when he's fighting in Egypt?
So the situation in Egypt is actually not very well attested. We don't have a lot of information about those troops, but we do have the very interesting testimony of Xenophon, who himself fought as a mercenary in service of a pretender to the Persian throne. So again, these are Greeks who are fighting for a Persian against another Persian, which is the sort of the start of this big phenomenon in the 4th century. And in the big battle that they fight, like this mercenary army fights against the forces of the Persian king, they are stationed over against a force of Egyptian infantry. And he describes this unit in some detail. And the Egyptian infantry, according to him, have a very particular way of fighting, which is to say they have very large, heavy tower shields that reach all the way to their feet, which they fight by literally just putting that on the ground and pushing it. And then their offensive weapon is a very, very long pike. And they also have long swords to defend themselves in close combat. And they form these really large blocks of infantry, of these sort of shield wall, massive tower shield blocks with pikes sticking out in all directions. And they're able to use these blocks quite efficiently in terms of maneuvering them, wheeling them, countermarching, changing its facing. So they're quite well trained and very heavy pike infantry, essentially. And the way he describes it, it's been sort of characterized as super hoplites. They're better than the Greeks at what the Greeks think they're good at.
But I mean, if we're thinking about Iphikrates' most famous victory, then he's very good at very heavy infantry.
just crushing them with light infantry. Yes, I mean that is definitely one of the ways in which you can handle a force of heavy infantry at minimal risk to yourself. But the situation at Lycaon and in the other major victories of light armed troops against heavy infantry, the key is that there is a lot of space, there's a lot of time, and that usually it also requires that the light armed troops massively outnumber the heavies. So you have to be in a situation where you have the space and the time to maneuver, to do this sort of salvo, this endless waves of attacking and retreating, until your enemy is finally worn out and broken down. And the attrition rate in these battles is very, very low. This isn't like Rome Total War where a single, volley of javelins can wipe out half a unit. There's only a couple of casualties with each volley, but they build up over time and they wear out they exhaust as much as they deplete the enemy unit. They just sort of wear them out with the constant running and going back and running and seeking shelter. And so it's a very slow process. It's almost guaranteed to work if you have enough time and space to do it. But of course, in a campaign as aggressive or a campaign of invading Egypt with a very large Egyptian army confronting you, you just don't have time to sort of engineer the conditions or await the conditions in which you can fight a battle like that. So he has to try and find some other solution to try and confront these Egyptian pikemen.
Is this where we then see, because this is something we kind of be dancing around or kind of just, I guess, blatantly ignoring, is this where we see Iphikrates' famous reforms come in? Because if he's come down to us through history as famous for one thing, it's not the Battle of Lycaon. It's this idea that he, totally reorganized the Greek fighting style to be more focused on these peltasts.
Yes, so he has a reputation for supposedly reforming hoplites into peltasts. Basically saying he took these men who were very heavy equipment and they were very cumbersome, and he turned them into a lighter, more flexible kind of warrior. And he did this by adapting their equipment. Now, all of the accounts we have two accounts of these reforms. All of them are very late. They all date to the Roman period, basically 1st century BC. None of the contemporary sources ever record any of them. So it's difficult for us to get a hold of what they are describing and whether this is a real thing. There's no historical context within which these things appear, clearly are being used. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what does this mean? Is this a real thing? Is this something that he really did, or did they just make that up? And what modern scholars have argued is that probably the most likely situation in which these reforms make sense is precisely this Egyptian campaign. So he has a bunch of mercenaries who in close combat would be inadequate against their Egyptian opponents, because whether they're hoplites or peltas, they're not going to be able to break that massive pike block that the Egyptians are going to use against them. And so he decides, or, at least if we are understanding this right, he may have decided to reform his infantry by re-equipping them with lighter shields, not the sort of big, bulky, heavy hoplite shields, lighter armor, and giving them very long pikes. So to counter pikemen with other pikemen.
But it seems like lighter armored, I guess more mobile pikemen?
Yeah, so the idea is that these troops are simultaneously, this is the bizarre thing. It's a contradictory development in a way. Like, they are described as being more lightly equipped, but at the same time armed with longer and heavier arms. So very long pikes instead of their usual spears, very long swords instead of their usual short swords. So they are described as becoming essentially more like Macedonian pikemen. And the argument there is that they become more mobile and more flexible that way. But of course, I mean, as modern scholars have pointed out, like, if you equip someone as a pikeman, they can no longer fight individually, because when you're wielding a pike, you can't reach an opponent who comes within sort of the range of your pike hit. So you can't fight very effectively as a single person. You have to fight as part of a formation. And that formation, because the shields are smaller, also has to be quite tightly packed in order to be effective defensively. So in some ways, the individual soldiers are becoming lighter and more flexible, but in another way, they're also becoming they're forced to be heavier, to work together as a unit more, and to become dependent on a very heavy and tight formation. So it's kind of contradictory what they're trying to say that Iphikrates supposedly did. But if he ever did anything like this, the only sensible context for it must be the Egyptian situation that he was facing in the 370s.
Because if I recall correctly, some of the sources say that he was, very famously a very disciplined man, a very kind of disciplined, taskmaster and leader. Couldn't we, if we're kind of digging through the pieces, the drips and drabs of that history has left us about his career, couldn't we say that if someone was going to take essentially a group of hoplites and peltasts and form them into this new kind of pikemen, then that would require a great more unit cohesiveness? Wouldn't it be someone like Iphikrates who could kind of enforce that discipline?
Yes, it absolutely would. The only problem is that his reputation, he has a reputation in later authors as being this ruthless disciplinarian, this drill master. And they say that, there's all sorts of stories connected to him about his severity as a drill master and as a general. And it said that, at a word from his mouth, all of his soldiers would sort of find their position in a line as if they had each individually been pushed there by the most skilled captains. This idea of they're memorizing and working out their pattern drills and their formation drills to this absolute point of perfection. But the problem is that, again, no contemporary source makes him out to be like that. And so the question is, was he really like that? Or are we attaching later features of other generals to this character simply because he seems the appropriate figure for them? And we have one source, Xenophon actually describes one time when he is a training master at one point. Like, he's given a naval force to try and interfere. Again, like, he's been called up because there's a situation and the Athenians need it fixed in a hurry, so they call on Iphikrates. He gets given a naval force that he needs to go and sail all the way around Greece to Kerkyra, which is modern Corfu. And he sails over there, but he has to try and find a way to make this completely inexperienced force into a naval force to be reckoned with. And so Xenophon praises him for figuring out a way to make sure that these troops are sort of simultaneously making the journey and training themselves. He's basically encouraging them to compete, to race, to maneuver while they're moving, to have this sort of prize for the person who manages to beach his trireme first every night when they have to make landfall. And that he's trying to sort of work out ways to simultaneously travel and train his rowers, so that by the time they arrive at Corfu, they're a well-trained, very capable, experienced naval force. And presumably this is the origin of the tradition, that he was this sort of disciplinarian and drill master. But we don't have any other examples from contemporary sources that confirm this. Most of that is just tall tales that get attached to him later on.
So there may kind of be like a small grain of truth about him being, a very disciplined, leader, or that then gets blown up into this idea that he was this amazingly clockwork general, or he wins this very famous battle using light troops, against the Spartan Mora, and then all of a sudden he's this brilliant leader of light troops.
Exactly. I mean, there's very much a tendency in later antique sources, so sources from after the classical period, to credit generals, if they are famous for a particular victory, especially if they've beaten Spartans, they are credited with all sorts of superpowers, because how else could they have done it? How else could they have achieved something like that? But we really have to kind of look through that and try and filter out the things that may have been real and may have a real background, and other things that may just be tall tales. And there's a lot that we could say about, for instance, the Theban general Epaminondas, who beats the Spartans in battle at Leuctra. He gets this enormous reputation for tactical genius that has no foundation in contemporary sources. Similarly, with Iphikrates, the reason that he gets called such a disciplinarian, it may well be because, as you say, he defeated the Spartans. How do you do it? Well, obviously, just some ordinary rabble of light troops couldn't possibly have managed it, even though from all the accounts that we have, it seems perfectly sensible that they did. That seems to happen all through Greek warfare. But for later authors trying to give this a place, trying to make sense of this, it seems to have been tempting to credit these people with sort of supernatural ability to manage troops.
I mean, this kind of brings us to another point, because if there's one thing that I learned about, talking to you in advance of this, is that, it seems like even later authors, not these classical era authors, but authors more in the modern era, really are in very disagreement about whether, these reforms that he made ever happened or when they happened. Apparently there's a school of thought that says he had been making these kind of reforms even before his victory over the Spartans, and that's what allowed him to have victory over the Spartans. And then there's another group that says, no, these reforms are much later. And then there's another group that says these reforms never happened whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a very, very complicated debate. And the reason for that, as I just said, is primarily because the sources are so bad. They're very late, they're confused, they say things that make no sense, they're contradictory, they sometimes don't seem to know what they're doing. Like these accounts of his reforms, they say that Iphikrates invented the peltas. We know that isn't true. Peltas have been around for centuries before that time. They're on vases, they're in texts, they're everywhere. We know that peltas are a thing before Iphikrates comes to the fore. But according to these late sources, who are clearly just not sure what they're describing, they say, he turned hoplites into peltas. Previously, there were hoplites and no peltas. After Iphikrates, there are peltas and no hoplites. There's just this bizarre idea that he fundamentally changed the nature of Greek combat in these late authors. And modern authors have struggled with this, basically trying to reconcile classical authors who make no mention of this with these later accounts. And they've tried to find different ways to make them sort of fit together, because we're really reluctant to throw out any of the evidence we have. But in this case, we clearly can't have both. It just doesn't work together. These accounts make no sense if we read them in light of what Xenophon says actually happened. And so different authors have taken different solutions to this. And some of them, as you said, primarily because they just can't believe that Iphikrates could have managed to defeat Spartans. They decided that, they must be, these reforms must have happened before he fought the Spartans, and they must be the reason for his victory. Again, they're trying to credit Iphikrates with essential superpowers in order to explain his stellar record. But others have said, these accounts are so problematic and so late, and they make so little sense, it would be much more plausible to say that these reforms never happened. They just made them up after the fact. This is a late tradition that has no reflection in contemporary sources. Maybe this never happened. And what I've just been describing to you about the Egyptian campaign, that's kind of the middle ground that now seems to have more or less won the argument to some extent. Like, more and more scholars are on board with the idea that if these reforms actually happened, it must be in the context of the Egyptian campaign. And the main reason for that, apart from, as I said, the tactical reasons, he needs pikemen to fight pikemen, so that makes sense that he created them at that time. And it doesn't require Xenophon to describe those same pikemen, because they don't actually do anything in Greece. They are not a part of his narrative of Greek history. So it explains those two things. It also explains why Diodorus, when he reports the reforms, he puts them in the narrative of the Egyptian campaign. So he says, this is, Iphikrates did all these things, and also he was a great reformer, and then, describes all these reforms. And then he closes that narrative by saying, but the Egyptian campaign was a failure. So we clearly need to be seeing this in that context. We need to be seeing this in terms of what did Iphikrates need to do in order to defeat the Egyptians. But many modern authors have sort of run away with this and gone like, oh, this is something that never happened, or on the other hand, this is something that he did very early on in his career, and it explains all his successes. There are completely divergent accounts from dozens of different authors on when exactly these reforms happened and what purpose they served.
Well, you kind of answered the other question I was going to ask there about how did the Egyptian campaign turn out?
Oh yeah, no, it was a disaster, and nothing to the fault of Iphikrates, according to the account we have, which is again Diodorus. So it's it's a 1st century BC account. This is not mentioned in Xenophon, but probably derives from a 4th century historian called Ephikrates. Now, he describes that essentially they march into Egypt, they avoid the strongest positions that the Egyptians are defending, they manage to infiltrate the delta. But at that point, Iphikrates recommends that they should capture Memphis, the Egyptian capital, straight away. But the Persian general, according to this account, doesn't trust Iphikrates, and he says, "I think you're actually trying to seize Egypt for yourself, and that you would then, once you've seized Memphis, you would turn on us, the Persian part of the army, and you would claim Egypt for yourself," which is a slightly bizarre theory, but apparently this is what the Persian general believed, and so he refuses to let Iphikrates capture the city. After which, of course, the Egyptians pour in a massive garrison, and they can't take it after that. And they just sort of get pushed back further and further, and eventually they are forced to retreat from Egypt altogether, and the entire campaign is a complete failure. And in order to avoid the wrath of the Persian king, Iphikrates basically flees back to Athens.
Well, I want to ask one more question and then kind of bring us to an epilogue. And that question will probably be absolutely infuriating to you and pretty much any other kind of classicist who's listening. But this tension between what the classical sources say and what, or what ancient Greek sources say and what, later sources say in the classic period and, what we have now, could there be a resolution perhaps in writings that we no longer have or that did not survive to be copied down and transmitted to us throughout history?
I mean, it's always possible. There's sometimes we find new sources, and this does happen, mostly on papyrus. When you find things in the Egyptian desert or in the desert of Palestine, we sometimes find large deposits of papyrus on which lost texts are preserved. And we always have to hold out hope that one of these days we're going to actually get an account of these events that, will help us understand more of it. One thing that we know is that Diodorus and Nepos' account of the reforms derive from the same source. So they must have had a source for this, which is the same one. We just don't know what it is, and we know that it's lost. So if we could find that source, all of our problems would be solved, presumably, because we'd be able to tell where they got the idea that Iphikrates is a reformer and why this was important to them, why they thought that this was something worth recording when Xenophon didn't. Now, we do actually have, on papyrus found in Egypt, we have an alternative history of this period, which is known as the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia, because it was found in Oxyrhynchus. And it is not Xenophon, it is another source, and we don't quite know which one it is. Of the many historical sources that we know only by name, we cannot tell which author it is. But it preserves an alternative history of the 4th century, which in many ways helps us to sort of contextualize and understand better what Xenophon is doing in his account. The problem is that it breaks off too early, so it doesn't go down to the period when Iphikrates was active. And that means that ultimately it doesn't help us in this case. So we can only hope that either the rest of that account gets found somewhere, or that another account that helps us to understand this is eventually found, but we can only hope.
Or of course, that time machines get invented. But let's not cross our fingers waiting for that. And I kind of want to bring us now to an epilogue, because I really want to ask you kind of a two-part question here in the fact that, where does Iphikrates fit into changes to Greek warfare that are happening at this time? Because you had mentioned, that the kind of the pikemen that he is credited for inventing resembled Macedonian pikemen. And of course, Alexander the Great and, his father, Philip II of Macedon, would be making some very dramatic changes in the region in just a few decades after this. So where does Iphikrates fit into any changes that are going on to Greek warfare at the time, if there are any? And how do, I guess you would say, modern scholars kind of fit him into this time period?
So, I mean, this is going to be a long answer, I think. In terms of his, his reforms have often, the narrative that we get of his reforms have often turned Iphikrates into this sort of paragon of innovation, a military renewal that was supposedly happening in this period. And a lot of people have wanted to credit him with all sorts of different ways in which he updated and improved upon Greek military practice. But when we look at the actual narrative that we get for the Battle of Lycaon and the Battle of Abydos that I mentioned, and the other battles and campaigns in which Iphikrates is engaged, all through Greece and in northern Greece and the Aegean and in Egypt, he doesn't seem to be doing anything particularly new. He doesn't use any tactics or any particular forms of organization that are new. There's no evidence that he introduced any new kinds of weaponry, except perhaps in the Persian situation, the Persian situation in Egypt. He doesn't necessarily seem to have revolutionized warfare in any way. Rather, I would like to argue that he simply exemplifies the state of the art at the time. He's a general of a range of different skills applied in a range of different situations. He was able to use both different kinds of troops, both mercenaries and citizens, both land troops and naval troops, in order to solve the problems that his city-state was facing. So he was a very effective general in the context of classical warfare. He was not necessarily sort of a child ahead of his time or something that sort of belongs in a list of, that needs to be credited with sort of superpowers in order to achieve what he achieved. However, if it is true that he reformed his mercenaries into pikemen in order to fight the Egyptians, then that is a very tantalizing possibility that this did affect Greek warfare in the long run. And the reason is that, quite simply, the reforms that Philip II carried out in order to create the Macedonian pike phalanx, which, of course, under Alexander conquered the entire Persian Empire, the problem is that those reforms are very poorly attested and very difficult to explain. We don't know where they come from. We don't know where the idea of a pike phalanx actually comes from, within a context of warfare which was traditionally much more about hoplite fighting with short spears and big shields, and light infantry and cavalry fighting, like cavalry fighting that was mobile and that was flexible and that was missile-based. So you have different kinds of fighting, neither of which are anything like these big pike blocks with very large pikes and small shields. There's nothing like that. And so the question has been for a very long time, where does this come from? Where is he getting this idea? Philip II, when he reforms the army, how does he come up with the idea of creating a large pike block? And of course, the only example of a proto-pike block that we have in this period is those of Iphikrates, the ones that are described to us by these Roman authors as the Iphikrateans or the Iphikrates. People who have been reformed from hoplites or peltas into proto-pikemen. Now, we can assume that these later authors have basically tried to create a stepping stone. They've tried to make sense of the narrative that goes from hoplites to pikemen by inserting an intermediate step. By saying, Iphikrates anticipated all this. He basically did all this that's sort of midway between hoplites and pikemen, and this sort of creates a beautiful progressive narrative from one thing to the next. But we can also assume that if they preserve a genuine tradition, that it's not quite so sort of evolutionary. It's much more like he tried to apply his innovations to a very particular situation. He was forced to fight Egyptian pikemen, and in order to do that, he reformed his infantry and he gave them new equipment. And when he went back home to Greece in the late 370s and served for a while as an Athenian general in Thrace, he tried to recapture the city of Amphipolis for Athens. When he was there, he must have basically told people what he had done. He told people what his service in Egypt was like, and he must have explained to people how he had reformed his army if he really did that. And the interesting thing here is that he didn't just sort of serve in northern Greece. He had intimate ties with the Macedonian royal house. He was the adopted son of King Amyntas, which had happened earlier in the 380s. He was adopted by King Amyntas. He knew the family, the royal family, and he supported them in their claim to the throne in the early 360s. In fact, when there was a throne crisis in Macedon in this period, because Iphikrates was in the area, the Macedonian royal family and the mother of Philip fled to Iphikrates and said, "Please help us. We need to get our throne back." And he did. He duly helped them and put a person friendly to their faction on the throne. But when the Macedonian queen fled to Iphikrates, she brought with him her 2 little children. And one of those children was Philip II. He was a young boy at the time in the early 360s. He was about maybe 12, 14. And he came with his mother to see Iphikrates and to beg Iphikrates for help. And Iphikrates actually became, at this point, his godfather. So there's close family ties, there's close relations between them. And we have to ask ourselves, what stories would a veteran general tell his Macedonian royal godson? What kind of stories would he tell him in order to show what leadership is like? How to solve different military situations, how to respond to challenges to your authority and to your military capacity? What kind of stories would he tell? It is perfectly possible that the story he told them is, when I was in Egypt, I had to turn my hoplites into pikemen. And there we have it. That's where Philip got it, perhaps. Unfortunately, we don't know, because no source tells us this in so many words, but it's all too tempting to think about the possibility that Philip II and the Macedonian pikemen, that they learned this from Iphikrates, because he was the one who tried it first.
Well, Rule, on that amazing thread of speculation and tantalizing little tidbit, I want to thank you for speaking to us on the Ask Historians podcast today.
It's my great pleasure once again. Thank you so much for having me.
And as always, a big thanks to all of you for listening. I hope you really enjoyed this episode as much as I did, at least, I hope. And an extra big thanks to all of our Patreon supporters. If you want to become a supporter of the show and get in on our monthly book giveaways, you can go to patreon.com/AskHistorians. And $1 a month gets you 1 ticket in the book giveaway, $5 2 tickets, $10 3 tickets. And then if you do $15 a month, I will look at you kind of side-eyed and think, why are you giving us so much money? But I will say your name on the air. So, plugs aside, I hope you really enjoyed this episode and kind of saw, I think part of the reason I like this episode, part of the reason is I just love our guest's enthusiasm and breadth and depth of knowledge, but also the fact that this episode is a lot about the difficulty of sources, particularly in ancient history or classical history or parts of history which we would call kind of perihistorical. The kind of definition of history, sometimes the very crude one, is that history starts when stuff starts getting written down. And a lot of times we have areas like my own interest in Mesoamerica where things didn't really get written down a whole lot, or what's left of like Maya scripts are really not very informative of a lot of kind of the daily life of things, or really beyond a lot of kind of very high level elite things. And then what we have later written down is really, again, it's focused a lot on very particular people and very particular things. So it's interesting to see how other fields and other parts of the world deal with this, where you have these very kind of small snippets that come down to us through preserved fragments of contemporary times and then get reinterpreted or get kind of recounted or changed or talked about by, later scholars in the Roman period, and then kind of filter down through 19th century classicists and then into today. So just kind of looking back and saying, well, this is what we know about Iphikrates, and then having to say, but what do we really know about Iphikrates? And then trying to piece together, some amazing things such as the tantalizing connection to Alexander the Great there. So it's a wonderful episode, I think, if I may toot my own horn about it. Coming up in the next episode, however, we are going to be introducing my other co-host who's going to be coming in. So we are going to, if you recall, Brian Watson, who is Annals Pornography. He did the episode a couple episodes back on the Society for the Reformation of Manners. He's going to be coming on as a co-host as well. So the way this is going to be going is that I will be doing every other podcast. And then they will, then my other 2 co-hosts will be filling in the blanks in between there. So Andres and Brian are going to be voices you'll be hearing a lot more of. So if you hate my voice, you'll be getting 50% less of something you hate yet inexplicably still listen to. And if you love my voice, unfortunately, you'll be getting 50% less of us. But you will be getting 2 brand new lovely voices as well. So I hope you're looking forward to the next episode coming up. I know the last episode we put out a little late, and it's just new hosts have some growing pains. I had some growing pains of my own. We're working together to get things nice and smooth, but there may be a few bumps along the road as we kind of adjust to the new reality of this triumvirate of us. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you've enjoyed past shows. If you're new to the podcast, I recommend you kind of start winding your way back through the catalog, starting with the newer episodes, as the older ones, of course, growing pains, have some problems there. We just weren't as technically competent as we are now. So, but enough rambling from me. We're going to go ahead and close out here just with our constant reminder. If you like the show, feel free to rate and review us on iTunes or Google Play or whatever you happen to get your podcasts through. I know there's 100 billion apps out there. I don't know if they all allow individual rankings. I know a lot of them are tied into iTunes. But again, I'm rambling again. So if you like the show, go out and tell somebody. If you don't like the show, don't tell anyone at all. Until then, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.